Executive Director of the Data Transfer Initiative. I've been working on these issues for a long time, wearing a lot of different hats across the different people in this room who I know. Delighted to be here and delighted to welcome these two papers on innovation, AI, and antitrust, things that you may not have thought about in all three together at any point yet, but they are all extremely well interconnected. And as you can tell, I'm improvising all of this. Without further ado, I'm going to invite up first Ketan Ahuja to present his paper, and then Jan-Frederick Goehsl will go after that, and then we'll do a couple of questions from me and then go out to the audience. So Ketan, please. And the slides will come up, right? Great.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm Ketan, I'm a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School, and my paper's on innovation ecosystems in antitrust. So one thing we know is that innovation should be antitrust central harm. So if we think of GDP as a product of technology, capital, and labor, people have over the long term calculated in many different studies that technology is the main determinant in GDP growth. But innovation is often peripheral in antitrust cases. And that's, it often appears, but it's often not the main harm that litigants argue. And that can be because innovation harms are pretty hard to measure. But I think a large part of the reason is because antitrust law focuses on the incentive to innovate and often neglects questions around the ability to innovate. So how does innovation happen? Well, one view is that innovation happens because people work very hard at problems. So if you take effort and you add the incentive, then you get innovation. And this view suggests that innovation policy is really about maximizing the incentives of innovators. This is a view that's deeply embedded in neoclassical economics. But innovators, we know innovators need the incentive to innovate, but they also need the ability to innovate. So what goes into the ability to innovate? And here's a model that I'd like to suggest. Something researchers on innovation have found is that new technologies are often recombinations of existing technologies. So if you take a car and you add a battery to it, you get an electric car. That's a new technology. And this is a general finding across lots of domains. When we create new things, they're often a new combination of existing products or services. So this suggests that innovation policy should have a different objective, which is that it should make it easier for people to combine existing capabilities in new ways to create new products and services. And you can explore how this, like thinking about technology in this way, can be a good way of understanding lots of existing technologies. So this is Boeing's Dreamliner plane, and you can see that all the different parts of the plane, combinations of existing technologies from different places that have developed expertise in making lots of different parts of a plane, and then Boeing just adds them all together in a new architecture to create a new type of plane. So having different modules, having technology broken down into different modules that people can recombine is something that enables innovation. And we also know that innovation happens in supportive ecosystems. So innovation isn't spread evenly around the world, but it happens very intensively in a few specific places where all of the right ingredients for innovative activity exist in the same place. So these are places like San Francisco and Boston and New York, and Denver and Chicago are bigger cities than Boston, but Boston has a lot more innovation than Denver and Chicago because Boston has all the right ingredients for innovation to take place. And this presumably can't be about incentives because we assume that everyone in the US has the same incentive to innovate, but they just maybe don't have the right capabilities available to them. So I'd like to contrast for you two different models of how innovation happens. One is what I call innovation as incentives, focused on the incentive to innovate. And this is where the kind of central focus of inquiries on agents or innovators or firms And we think innovation here happens because innovators apply effort to a problem motivated by their incentives. And innovation policy should maximize innovators' incentives to innovate. And then another model is really about the ability to innovate. And the focus is different. The focus is really on relationships between agents, or kind of how different capabilities can be combined in an ecosystem. Innovation under this model happens because innovators have access to all of the capabilities or technologies they need to create new products and services. And then innovation policy should maximize innovators' access to these capabilities. And I think antitrust law focuses on innovation incentives rather than innovation capabilities for the most part. You can see this in reasoning in the US. So in the recent case against Facebook, Judge Boasberg went on and on about innovation incentives and talked about how Facebook needed to maintain the incentive to invest in its innovation. So Facebook's refusal to interoperate with competitors couldn't violate antitrust law. It also motivates European case law, and this is in a similar domain in European antitrust law, where the discussion in Oscar Bronner and Mediaprint was really all about the incentive to invest in particular facilities for distribution, and how we don't want to undermine that incentive. And it also motivates British competition law, where a lot of the narrative is really the same, kind of along the same reasoning or similar lines. And I think this idea of how innovation happens is really baked into the structure of antitrust. So, the process of market definition is really about figuring out a space where competitors go head to head against each other, as Fiona said earlier. And then we think about what are the incentives of different competitors in that space. The focus, the objects of study are often kind of firms and their incentives. And then what litigants have to prove in antitrust cases is often related to incentives. So for example, in a recent merger between United Healthcare and Change, was the government litigating to stop that merger had to prove that United Healthcare's incentives to innovate would be diminished. And then I think this is especially true in innovation spaces because innovation harms are often very hard to measure. And so we rely generally on these economic ideas to structure antitrust law. We had a whole panel on ecosystems earlier, so I'm just not going to go into that. But I think what this leads to is, I think antitrust case law often has this immune system against innovation arguments, where what you see often in cases is that innovation concerns may arise and an agency may try to intervene. But then somewhere in the discussion, lawyers or the court invokes this paradigm that innovation is about incentives. And then the debate in the case focuses on how do you best protect the incentives to innovate of different firms. And then courts really start to emphasize, okay, well, we need to protect the innovator's ability to profit from their innovations. And then the court declines to intervene. So it has this immune system that is a response to these arguments based on this incentive paradigm about how innovation takes place. And I think we can counter that by integrating ideas about innovation capabilities or the ability to innovate into antitrust. And I think we need a new language to do so. So I'm going to suggest to you a new lexicon for these sorts of arguments. One is that we need a word for a capability. If innovation is about the ability to innovate, and the ability to innovate comes from combining different technologies, then we need to be able to express that in a word for a capability, which I'm going to suggest is the ability to do or make something that's economically valuable. So this is really like tacit know-how or economically useful knowledge as applied in production. And we need to know how easy or hard are capabilities to transfer or recombine into new technologies. And so some capabilities are going to be encoded into manuals or codes, and some are going to be tacit knowledge based in teams or networks or groups of people. And then sometimes capabilities are going to be put into products as embodied knowledge, and that you can just use whenever you use a product. You don't need to know how to make the product. You can just plug it in, like Boeing assembling these different parts of an aircraft. I think we also need a way to express how capabilities are close or far from each other, which is just a measure of relational proximity or how easy they are to be combined. And then we need some way of expressing the techno-economic domain. So what is the domain of technology that defines the set of capabilities needed to innovate in a space? If you want to create a new technology, what are all the different sub-technologies that you need access to if you want to try and combine them in a new way? And I think this is really, I just want to contrast how this idea might be a bit different from antitrust's current intellectual architecture around market definition. So in antitrust, we often start cases by defining the market, where we say, okay, here's one horizontal market, and this is a downstream horizontal market, and then there's another conglomerate market, and we're really looking at how firms in these horizontal markets compete with each other, or how activity maybe from outside one market affects how firms in this horizontal market can go head to head. I think techno-economic domain, it's really a different concept. It's really about what are the inputs and outputs to a service, or what are the inputs and outputs to this kind of area of innovative activity. And then we need a word for modules and modularization. So if capabilities get transferred more easily when they're put into these modules that you can plug into different things, then we need a vocabulary that lets us speak about modularization and this process of compartmentalizing capabilities in ways that they can more easily be recombined. I had a good conversation earlier around open source software, and how open source software is a good example of this, where one of the reasons why innovation happens so effectively in the software domain is because you have all these open source packets of software that people can just pull in as plugins or APIs, and you don't need to rebuild a whole set of things, but it's very easy to recombine different bits of software because they're all in these different modules or packets or open source projects. So this gives us a new lexicon for thinking about the ability to innovate in antitrust law, where we say innovators combine capabilities in new ways to make new products and services. Innovation policy should aim to give innovators better access to capabilities that they need to innovate, making them more relationally proximate within a techno-economic domain. And antitrust can promote innovation by modularizing technologies or building blocks of production, giving innovators more access to different capabilities as modules. And we need a limiting principle, I think. This can't just be something that applies to everything. So let's go back to the start, where we said innovators need both the incentive to innovate and the ability to innovate. And I think we can balance these two in antitrust by saying we promote the ability to innovate until we start undermining incentives to innovate too much. And I think this leads to some policy prescriptions for antitrust. Many of these are the sorts of things that people discuss already in digital market spaces. But here's a different rationale for getting to them or justifying them or thinking about them. So within the space of anti-competitive agreements, we need to regulate exclusivity agreements that tend to tie up important capabilities. And we probably need to ban employee non-competes that prevent employees from moving around and taking their tacit know-how with them. This also would justify in merger regulation. It might apply to arguments around modularizing key capabilities. So you might want to keep two companies apart or bring them closer together because that makes them more or less proximate in different ways. And it might also restrict how we think or change how we think about acqui-hires. You don't want companies to go in and pick up a team where It means that suddenly a set of tacit know-how that was being put into products is now the exclusive domain of one company. And then it also helps us think about monopolization law and abuses by dominant companies and things like the essential facilities doctrine. So I'm going to close by suggesting a couple of legal tests that we could use in antitrust case law and thought to implement some of these ideas. So we might start by assessing the techno-economic domain alongside defining a market. And then we might ask, are there capabilities within this domain that are particularly important? And can many market participants access these capabilities easily? And then we might ask, how does the antitrust event change how market participants can access these capabilities? Does it make it easier or harder in the domain as a whole for innovators to access these capabilities? And then we might balance efficiencies or trade-offs and apply our limiting principle where we don't want to undermine incentives to innovate too much. So I think this is the subject of my paper, and I thank you for listening.
Hello again. Just for the sake of completeness, I have nothing to disclose. And I want to change the perspective now with this talk and taking a look at the competitive behavior of newcomers when they probably happen to disrupt a digital market. So just to give a quick overview about the topics I want to cover, I would just want to briefly touch on how AI-driven disruption works in the digital economy and how newcomers can be successful in a certain market segment. And with this, my main thesis is that the emergence of a disruptive newcomer may not lead to an overall increase of market contestability, so more competition, more open markets in the digital economy. The second point, I'm then questioning how we should deal with that insight from a competition policy perspective. And there, my conclusion is that we should think about applying some competition rules also to disruptive newcomers, because this might be necessary to prevent further market tipping in these new market segments and also to prevent the unfair building of new digital ecosystems. And in the third part of the presentation, I want to deal with some newcomer rules that are already existent in the DMA and also by applying competition rules to these scenarios. So let me start with a very, very brief introduction of how AI-driven disruptions work. And for this, you just have to make sure that you remember that indirect competition trumps direct competition in the digital economy. So a competitive threat for the incumbent probably comes from another market or market segment with another business model. And for that, there are different approaches in management literature to explain the market success of a newcomer. And this can also be applied to AI. And the first theory that can be applied to AI newcomers is the demand-oriented approach that was put forward by Clayton Christensen and the theory of disruptive innovation in the late 90s and was then developed further for the digital economy, especially by Joshua Ganz. And this is the new market disruption subcategory applying to AI, because when we consider the business model, for example, of Perplexity and also of ChatGPT or ChatGPT search, they are catering for a different group of users than, for example, traditional search engines do. But they are also reining in the business model of, for example, search engines, as we have seen before in the presentation. So it's kindly split between catering a new demand and some forms of existing demand. So they have, because they cater for this new demand, the option to gain a foothold in the market and to establish themselves beside of the incumbent being present. And the second theory is the capabilities-oriented approach, which was put forward by Henderson and Clark and also by David Teese. And this is more in line with the business model of TikTok. When TikTok came to the US and Europe, they relied on a different algorithm and also a different form of presentation in the social media markets by relying on short videos and reels. And this was also based on a different technology that couldn't be easily followed by Meta, by Instagram and Facebook. And this allowed TikTok to gain a foothold in the market, especially for younger users, and then establish a form of market power in this market segment. So when we consider how AI-driven disruption works, we can ask what will be the medium and long-term market outcomes. And for this, I think it's necessary to make clear that disruption, so the change in the market structure, does not necessarily mean that there is a form of creative destruction, which I mean by the incumbent being driven out of the market by the newcomer. Instead, there are several outcomes possible, and I try to elaborate on that a bit deeper in my paper. One obvious option is, of course, creative destruction, so the incumbent leaving the market, but this is very, very unlikely for the digital economy because the incumbents have the means for a successful defense strategy because they have sufficient funds and also the capabilities to address threats from AI services. So we will probably see more likely a successful defense, for example, Google also introducing AI overviews and therefore defending against, for example, ChatGPT and also Perplexity, so by changing and self-disrupting their business model, which might lead also to the newcomers being completely driven out of the market in the future. But as I conclude in the paper, the most likely scenario is that we'll see some form of market segmentation, that the incumbents are catering for some parts of the demand with a legacy service that is partly adapted to the disruptive service, for example, here AI and Google Search and introducing AI overviews, but the newcomers also catering for parts of the demand and then establishing themselves in the presence of the newcomer. So this would probably lead then to the emergence of disruptive newcomers, but not to more competition because they will probably share the market. So if we consider that, we can ask a question, should competition law address this issue and care also about newcomers? And you could really question that from a first perspective, because when we consider the balance between supporting innovation and protecting competition, we could say, well, this is good for innovation and this is also good for competition when we take into account that they probably pose a competitive threat to the incumbent. But I think when we consider that protecting the competitive process is the benchmark, this would be probably a bit too short-sighted because when disruption is really successful, the newcomer will have a position of power in its market segment, despite the incumbent's market presence. So also the newcomer can exert some of anti-competitive means by trying to tip the market segment in which it is present and also engage in some of the unfair ecosystem development, for example, applying platform development strategies. So from my perspective, we should think about intervening much earlier with regard to newcomers when they apply tipping strategies or the building of ecosystems in order to make markets in the future more open than they are today. So we can, after that, consider how competition law currently deals with newcomers. And the first thing that at least comes to mind from a European perspective is the Digital Markets Act. And the DMA contains in its present form a newcomer rule in Article 17.4 of the DMA, but it is kind of ineffective for AI because, as I've mentioned earlier, it's not applicable to most of the AI services in its current form. And the second problem with the newcomer rule is that it's mostly about exploitation. So it's not taking into account that newcomers can also engage in exclusionary strategies, trying to tip their market segment, but more about exploiting some of the business users. So from my perspective, the DMA is probably ineffective for that. So we should go back to the application of Article 102 TFEU or Section 2 of the Sherman Act. And for this, the first insight is that, of course, market definition is crucial because if we consider the incumbent and the newcomer being in the same market, it is very unlikely that we can establish market dominance for the newcomer. So we should ask the question, when is it appropriate to define separate markets? And for that, the first insight is that the perspective we should take into account should not be technologically backward looking. So we can't rely on existing case law because after the disruption, markets will change and look differently. So probably we can't rely in Europe on the Google Shopping or Google Android case for this, because the markets have changed and we can't really get insights and precedents from that. Because of that, I propose that we get a more forward-looking perspective by including insights from disruption theory and ask 3 questions. The first one would be, does the business model of the newcomer involve a feature that cannot be duplicated by the incumbent? Because then it is quite likely that it can control a form of new user demand. The second question is the newcomer serving new demand a unique user base going in the same direction that they can get a form of market power despite the incumbent being present? And the third question, has the newcomer new technological capabilities more in line with the capabilities form of disruption? So is there a technology the newcomer is using that the incumbent can't easily copy? If you answer these questions with yes, you should probably define a separate market for the newcomer. When you define a separate market for the newcomer, the next question would be, could you establish market dominance? And for that, you should also apply a forward-looking perspective and take into account that the current market shares are not really fully indicative for this fast-moving market development. Instead, you should ask, is there a competitive edge over other innovative firms in the segment and also over the incumbent? And to answer this question, you should rely on dynamic competition capabilities. And for example, you should rely on these relevant parameters. So you should take a look at the absolute and relative numbers of unique users. So how much is the new demand that is controlled by the newcomer? The second question is then, how is the funding structure? So is there any backing of, or how high is the backing of venture capital? And also the cooperation with big companies, because the cooperation of big companies will probably give them access to technological aspects like preferential aspects, access to data, or also to compute, which will give them an advantage in comparison to other companies. And also, is there a position of power in other regional markets, for example, in other countries? Because TikTok, when it came to Europe and also to the US, it had already established a dominant or a successful position in China, had some economies of scale and scope and also data advantages. So it was much easier to come to another market and there be successful there. So if you then establish market dominance, you should take into account when you apply different theories of harm that you should only care about exclusionary practices that maybe lead to market tipping or the building of unfair ecosystems by platform development, but not about or care about exploitation, because you have to give the newcomer a sufficient incentive to recoup the costs for the innovation, and therefore you should not apply some exploitation strategies that are currently the main focus of the DMA's rule for newcomers. Therefore, I would like to conclude that AI-driven disruptions may not increase market contestability, and that we need some tipping and ecosystem rules also for newcomers, that the DMA scope is unclear here, and that the newcomer rule is not fully effective. Therefore, we should rely on competition law, and this can play a vital role, but we need to apply it more forward-looking and obviously more prudently, because we should change the competition enforcement in this regard to intervene in these markets much earlier, as we have also heard before in a panel today, to not make the same mistakes in the digital economy we made 15 to 10 years ago, and to maybe lead to more open and fairer markets in the future. Thank you. And if you're interested to take a look at the final paper, you can download it via the QR code. Thank you.
Backup speaker. And thank you, Frederick, as well. I don't know. Push, there we go, sorry. Thank you as well for reminding me about the disclosures. I will say that the Data Transfer Initiative, the organization I run, does work with tech companies. We do receive funding from them as well. We are not a trade association. Nothing I say, nothing we do represents the tech companies that we work with, a set that includes Google, Amazon, Apple, and Meta, as well as a handful of smaller companies, both in the United States and in Europe. I really enjoyed both of these papers. It also reminded me, which I had not thought about until Frederick was speaking, that many moons ago, I went on the legal market, the law academia market, thinking I wanted to be a law professor, but for a different path, et cetera, et cetera. But my job talk paper at the time was about the interconnection of elements necessary to be viable in the internet economy. And it was specifically on Christensen and disruptive innovation, creative destruction theories. And my argument was, when incumbents can block access to those elements necessary to be part of the economy, a lot of that theory gets disrupted. When they can control key resources or capabilities that are needed by indirect competitors, it breaks a lot of the economic models and thinking. So anyway, that came back to mind many, many years later as you were speaking. The first question I have is for Frederick, so I'm going to keep you with the virtual microphone and then come back to Ketan. The fundamental insight from your paper, as I see it, is that disruption will not inherently displace dominant market players. It certainly feels right. Perhaps it has always been true. Perhaps this was indicative of the kinds of things I was thinking about many years ago. What has happened with AI? Is it increasing in effect? Your paper says AI-driven business models differ from traditional business models in ways that I'm sure are very relevant to this theory. Can we dig in on that a little bit more? And do the kinds of capabilities and the ability to innovate that Ketan wrote about in his work fit in here? Perhaps, for example, in the forward-looking interventions you mentioned, is that where we can find some competitive edges or some restrictions thereof?
Thank you very much for this question. And yes, of course, it's part of disruption theory that the incumbent doesn't really notice that there is a disruption going on. And because of that, they can't really adapt to their business model. And that's the reason why traditional disruption theory thinks that they are going out of the market. But that's probably not true for AI markets, because the current incumbents are pretty much prepared for this disruption, because it was quite obvious that this AI is in what form ever coming to the digital economy, and they were investing very heavily the last decade into AI and be ready. So because they were so successful in the platform markets, they have the sufficient funds and could also invest in the technologies necessary to also be very successful in AI markets. And despite that, they probably haven't really expected how AI will play out in the digital economy, they had at least the potential to really set the stage that they can play a vital role in this competition. And I think they are very successful doing that. And because of that, because of the technical features and also the economic features and the economic power of the current incumbents being so intertwined here, this is different than with regard to disruption than in traditional markets. And when we consider like the business model of AI, it's also quite different, because when we consider generative AI or agentic AI in the future, it has the potential to disintermediate to a certain extent platform markets, because consumers don't really have to rely on platforms in the way we're using them at the moment, but you can only use, for example, a shopping agent I mentioned before, and just visit the retailers' websites. And therefore, also the technology is quite different than we have seen before in the digital economy, I think. And the capabilities, I think our papers really match quite well with regard to the capabilities approach, because we agree on that we should really integrate more capabilities, understanding and antitrust law enforcement. And I think that our approach matches quite well.
Thanks. I fully agree. For Ketan, you articulate capability as codes, manuals, tacit knowledge, embodied knowledge. What about resources or inputs? How much do we need to consider the availability of the resources that are required that go into the innovative outputs? And this is drawing from my work on data portability, where our goal is helping users move their personal data from one service to another. And it's motivated by the belief that that unlocks downstream innovation in potentially very significant ways, in addition to allowing for greater horizontal competition in certain contexts and circumstances. Do you think that fits in here too? What kinds of resources are involved? How can we translate this vision for the things that are required to innovate into sort of a technical practice? I know the appendix to your paper references open APIs, which certainly seems like a good example here. And then a bonus additional question. Lots of innovation is happening in AI, combining LLMs with interesting data sets and problem spaces. So the same sort of questions about what granularly goes into making innovation possible, and does AI change that in significant ways?
Great questions. Thanks for the reminder as well about disclosures. I received a small amount of support from the Roosevelt Institute for an earlier version of this project. On your question around definition of capabilities and whether it includes resources and inputs, I thought pretty hard in this paper about exactly how to define capabilities. And what I ended up landing on was that I didn't think it was right to define it in too restrictive a way. So I think I ended up considering capabilities to be applied knowledge that's useful in production. So the knowledge to make or do things that's economically valuable. And I think it would include resources or inputs. The ability to do things. I was that kind of codes, tacit knowledge, embodied knowledge was sort of more thinking about how tacit know-how is transmitted. And embodied knowledge is like it might be a product or an input or some kind of resource that you need to engage in a market. But basically, if you need certain sets of things to innovate within a techno-economic domain, whether they're inputs or resources, you probably don't want to push too hard on trying to include or exclude certain kind of categories of things. Go for more of like a purposive definition. I think it's a really interesting idea around how LLMs will open up different forms of know-how in production. One thing that as humans, it takes us a really long time to learn a new skill. They say it takes 10,000 hours, and that's often years of study. And LLMs take often, in a spiky way, not consistently, but they take that tacit know-how and put it in a machine and make it available to lots of different people. So I'd have to think that LLMs have to be a force for driving innovation, in that they make it a lot easier for people to access different bodies of knowledge that they might then wish to recombine in new ways to create new products and services. But I think that's just an intuition, and we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. It's also interesting to me that I think both of your papers really take a forward-looking, sort of proactive approach to thinking about how to promote innovation, which is just in very stark contrast to antitrust enforcement, which is a process that is more retroactive in nature and can take a very, very long time. Not meant to malign either approach, just to note the complementarity of them and the differences in context in which they are best applied and best used. I'd like to turn it over to the audience for questions. I saw one hand up over there earlier, so if we could get the microphone around, and then second, right here, Sanders running over with a microphone from this side, and then we've got the second lined up.
Hi, thanks. My question is for Ketan. So in your discussion of innovation, the build-up, we did not see much of discussion on the problem definition or like the crisis that leads to innovation, because problems, like innovation gives you a solution to a problem, but there was not much discussion on the problem. And I'm guessing the crisis or the seriousness of crisis is a big determinant of the capability or the ability to innovate. So when we are discussing the term capability, and when we are trying to build metrics around it or trying to build a test around it, and if capability is subjective, then how can we go about building up a test? And so just your perspective on that.
It's an interesting question. I would have thought that the problem and the need to innovate is more around the demand for innovation rather than the supply. And capabilities, I kind of think of more as a supply side framework. Sometimes innovation emerges in response to a very urgent need. We saw that in the COVID pandemic, where it took a year for everyone to invent a COVID vaccine, and then we had 5. And there was a very urgent need and it created a problem, and there was a huge amount of incentive to innovate in one direction. But that also, sometimes innovation just responds to unexpected serendipity and tinkering and creativity. And, even then, those mRNA vaccines were built on, 30 years of research that was pushed in one direction that most people didn't think was particularly promising, wasn't necessarily, as foundational research, wasn't necessarily geared towards solving any particular immediate need, other than it might open up a new domain of possibilities. So I think both are important. And yeah, I think, the problem space is very important. It just wasn't necessarily in my framework.
I'll have to give a brief shout out to Ed Felton's original notion of the freedom to tinker, which is one of the things that certainly inspired me to get into this line of work. Second question over here.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the papers. And I would ask to Ketan some ideas that crossed my mind. So the first one is, how do you relate the concept that you're bringing, the innovation as capabilities, with the concept of innovation markets, the ones from the beginning of the 90 decades here in US, for example? I think Gilbert and Sunshine and Faro Shapiro goes within this kind of this concept. And if you know what I mean, right? The innovation markets, the innovation relevant markets, when you were not talking about the existing product, but a future product, and you will include the firms that have the ability to make this so it's more about the who is able to make the innovate in that direction that you were afraid of. For example, a merger can change the incentives and the ability to innovate in that direction. So maybe pipeline. So Dow DuPont is a good example when you see the pipelines and whatever it's necessary to do to create or to make the innovation in a new product. So it's a new market. It's not a relevant market that already exists, of a product that already exists. So this is one question. And the question, and the other question is, how do you feel? So I do think it's very important to talk about capabilities and not only about incentives. And when thinking about digital, how do you, and I think that capabilities and incentives are also different when we are talking about a incremental innovation or a disruptive innovation. So I wanted to hear if you have any thoughts on that, talking about digital in the digital market. So my perception is that it's going to be very different depending on the gatekeepers and even the service that we're talking about. And so
Yeah,
that's
okay, great. No,
too
thank
many
you.
questions. Thank you.
No, those are great. So on innovation markets, I'm not super familiar with that literature, but I guess if there's a space of potential competition or innovation, there's a new technology, and you think about the market as all the set of firms that is able to innovate in that space, then I think that feels very complementary to this framework where, presumably if you can anticipate a future technology domain arising, then you'd want to increase the number of firms that might be able to innovate in that space. And that's often, the function of government investments in research and industrial policy, but it can be relevant to antitrust, where if there's a certain set of things you need to innovate in that space, then, and there's an antitrust event that triggers a case around those needs, then I think that sounds very relevant. I think in the digital space, I think this same framework would apply in digital and non-digital spaces. But in the digital space, we have obviously huge issues around gatekeepers and market power and access to digital forms of infrastructure that are very relevant. And so it would be pretty complementary to those sorts of theories of harm in digital cases as they've been brought.
All right, we have a question from Nick over there, I see, and then I see a couple more hands.
This is maybe a bit unfair, Ketan, but I wonder in about 45 seconds whether you could, using the approach that you describe, maybe redo the Google search case. Just, I'm kind of thinking
45
about,
seconds.
you know, where does this come in? Do we put this in the complaint of, you know, there's harms to innovation that go in the complaint? Do we then want a judgment about this in liability, or does this get brought out in remedies? And if you have thoughts about what might have happened in Google search that could have advanced this project.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think like many people, I think the liability finding was pretty good in Google search, but the remedies finding wasn't that great. I think this framework that I'm advocating for could apply as a question of abuse or liability, but it could also apply in discussions around remedies. So if we say that what needs to be improved in Google search is the remedies phase, then, you know, we'd ask questions instead around, you know, our motivating frame for remedies in Google search might be, what are the set of capabilities that search engine providers need to have access to be able to innovate as search engines. And I think some of that discussion came up in Google search. Okay, so search engine providers need access to data. They need this long tail of unique queries. And that's definitely something that came up. But maybe you'd bring more of this flavor into how search engine innovators need access to distribution. And distribution might be something that's a capability that innovators need to start gaining traction. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I don't know if I did a good job in 45 seconds, but thank you.
I think we can fit one more in, right? Do any of the hands up have a question for Frederick, since Ketan has gotten a lot of the love? If not, I'm going to claim moderator's prerogative and ask Frederick another question. All right. I'm going to claim a prerogative and ask Frederick a somewhat similar question to what I asked Ketan, which certainly reflects my own biases here. I really like the language in your paper that describes the measure of effectiveness of competition law interventions as whether the competitive process can operate undisturbedly. And then you then look into sort of traditional ways of evaluating that, network effects, economies of scale, and so forth. When I think about AI, I think about what's needed to compete in AI. You need access to chips. You need access to storage, to cloud infrastructure. You need access to researchers and talent. You need distribution access. You need a whole host of other things. Do you think we have a rich enough sort of understanding of how the competitive process operates undisturbedly in the AI context to reflect all of these elements? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, of course. And I think that's a valid point, and you should consider these factors because they're quite special for AI. And I didn't mean to neglect them, because they are the driving factors in order to be successful in AI markets. But I think when you consider the risk of tipping of markets, so after you established your business model, then the traditional factors like economies of scale, scope, and also network effects are also important in AI markets, because only then you can engage in tipping strategies or, for example, engaging in platform development, because this requires using your network effects in adjacent markets. And therefore, I think the interconnectedness of traditional factors and the special factors of AI competition, so access to data, personnel, and compute, are quite important to look how they will develop and how they work together. And I think in order to be successful, you have to have both. So preferential access, for example, to data, but also, for example, building your business model in a way that you can use with network effects or more traditional factors of power in the digital economy. So this is probably going to be interesting how the business models in this regard will develop in the future.
Thank you very much. And can we thank the speakers again, please?